Now, the first thing to do is to install the main output bearing. You want to make sure that it's fully seated and there's no gap around this edge, or else the bearing will be misaligned. Next, you're going to want to insert the shoulder bearings into the planet gears. Might have to use some tools to squeeze them down. Using a little spacer, insert the button head screws and just screw directly into the plastic. Then you can insert it into the gearbox, and a little bit of wiggling later, it should go into it fully. Start moving it about to make sure it's free, and then add some grease and then work that in. Now you need to install 2 long screws into the spur gear, and that adds the strength for the input. You can insert the bearing into the very flexible back carrier. You can see how flexy that is. And then go ahead and insert that gear. Things should basically be moving freely at this point. Probably wise to add a little more grease here since we can't easily get at this. Now insert 2 of the shoulder bearings into the idler gear, 1 for either side. And then place that. Now remember, the left and the right, these mounts have to be opposite each other. Tighten that in, make sure it's moving freely. Finally, it's the motor gear. The first thing to do here is make sure it's the correct orientation, and you can just push this on the D shape. I usually have to use a little bit of heat and force, and then we can install the set screw. Make sure it gets all the way in there. It should be below the surface of the teeth. You'll feel it lock up on the D shaft. Now we can insert that. You want your wires kind of following the suspension. Use 2 screws to get that in place. There'll be 4 holes, so you have to make sure. It's pretty simple with the idler gear getting in the way of 1. Make sure everything spins freely. Add a bunch more grease. And that's it. The next step is going to be installing the rear shock tower. These are going to take 4 bolts. And it just lines up in one orientation here. See how it matches with the angle of the suspension. Certainly use some power tools to make your lives a little easier. Next, we're going to need to install these bearings into the output hubs. The printing orientation of this is fairly important for strength. Use a tool to press these in to make your lives easier. Now, these pseudo shoulder bolts have kind of a smooth area, and just the end is threaded. And they'll thread directly into the plastic, but they'll pivot out here. So I like to ream these so that they're a perfect fit. They move smoothly. Then we can just place them on and insert those screws. Certainly use power tools to make your lives easy, but these back ones, well, ball nose hex is good. Make sure it's moving freely, and position the shock mounts towards the front. That's where we're going to stop now, though. So we're going to need our shocks now and the rest of these bits. First thing we're going to do is insert some more bearings. And again, the print orientation of these hubs is important, but if you need, use some tools to press them in. We can put the front shock tower straight down in. There's 4 small bolt holes in there, but there's also these jacking bolts that adjust the tension. Get those 4 bolts in. And then we can move on to the suspension arms. I like to have the bolt holes out the front. I think that's the best method for accessing them. And just use some power tools to connect absolutely everything. Onto the hubs, very simple. They're symmetric, so it doesn't really matter which way they go. And now we need to get an M5 nut down the back of these. Honestly, I like to use a bolt to pull it right completely through. It's a little annoying, but it's worth it. Now we can just shove those in there, and we're ready for the wheels. So before that, we can install the shocks. So there should be these 2 shock spacers. They slide in, slide the shock down through the upper control arm and then into the lower, and then just put a bolt in. I'm using the outside bolt holes. Screw them down. Same on the other side. And now for the shock towers, same bolts as well. Make sure everything moves freely. Now for the wheels, you can see how they're deep dished so that when we apply force near the center, it's much closer to the bearing. So just 2 small bolts will hold these on. Alignment's a little tricky, but it's pretty easy. Hex spacer as well. Shove those inside. You might want to put your thumb on it to hold it in place. And just tighten the, I don't know what I'm calling these. Do the other side, and you're done. Full front suspension. Okay, early disclaimer, make sure your nylon is dry if you're printing these in nylon. Very beneficial. We can't have any errors or blobs or stringing on any of these parts, especially like inside this area here. So you're going to need some 7/32 balls, but first we're going to put in an M5 nut inside of our CV output. You use a bolt to kind of wrench it down so it pulls into the hex shape. Next, we're going to need to force the balls into the cages. I usually have to use a little bit of heat to get this to go, but make sure they spin nice and freely. Now, that should insert fairly easily on the flat sides of both the cage and the CV. Make sure it and the cage moving freely. It's very important. Before we make sure they're set, grease. Let's add some more grease. Push it back in. Kind of get that grease to go around. I added a little more grease. And now it's time to position the cage. So we need to get the cage and everything lined up, and you pull up a corner. Placing 1 ball at a time, you push it in. And the first ones are going to act a bit weird, so you're going to have to kind of get to push down. You're going to have to force the cage, move things around. And then you rotate to one position over, pull up the cage, insert another ball, push it back down. The first 2 or 3, it's not going to act properly, so you keep having to force the cage up, push the ball in. I like to use the back of the tweezers to help me force it in. By the time you get to the 4th one, that cage is going to start moving pretty normally. And this is where I usually get an end, shove it on, and kind of push down all those ridges. So 5th ball, this is usually one of the hardest ones. And it went in, you kind of see how it deformed a little bit of the plastic on the way in, but keep doing it. And then the last one, I find having it off on an angle, having the ball stick out on an angle, or the ball joint stick out on an angle helps, but sometimes you'll have to just keep repositioning it just for those last few. And it might go, it might not. I'm doing this to demonstrate that these last ones are really, really finicky. You can notice that the angle that the output is on, or I should say the input, and it still didn't want to go, but we're close. Finally, it went in, and you can see how that cage is moving exactly half of that angle that we're at. And this is exactly how a ball cage should work. This is done by offsetting the cut arcs by just a little bit where the center of it is. Now, this causes it to kind of move in or out a fraction of a millimeter, but that's not a big deal. Next, we want to put on our actual axles. Printing these flat helps, but set screws really help because if they back out, it likes to snap axles, or at least the spline interface. So get one side all the way down, the other side as well, and then just alternate going back and forth so that you're actually tightening the same amount. You can cause it to kind of pop out on an angle if you don't do this. I'm using some of the longer set screws I have, and it kind of just jams in between the corner here like that. Next, we install the bearings on the tripod joints. Now, the tripod joints can slide in and out, and that's why we use these bearings on some M4 by 10 millimeter button head screws. And it's the exact same process with the set screws. And yeah, you're done. Complicated axle. So let's get those axles installed. Now we need our outputs and some lube again. So fill those tripod receivers, both sides. And then we can just shove the tripod in there and move it around so that every side gets lubed and kind of work it in a bit. Next, you can put on the output hub. Should just slide on. The top and the bottom are different sizes, so there's only one orientation. And then we're just back to using the power tools to put everything back together. We can also attach the shocks, and I forgot to print some pits, so we're moving on to the wheels. So these are actually M4s. Put the idler on the outside. I'm only using 3 bolts. Honestly, it's all you need. Don't forget your hex spacer. And your wheel goes on. And then that nut that we inserted earlier, well, that allows these hub bolts to catch on and just tighten those down. And that leads us to a functional rear end. Make sure everything just moves freely. All right, let's go get those shocks installed with the spacers, maybe some power tools. Make sure everything moves freely. This is very important. If something's binding, this is where we need to fix it. So we have the front, the rear, and the frame. They actually just kind of slide together, sort of. You notice that the front has some oval holes so that they can move back and forth. 4 bolts on each of these. So you just screw those down. Can slide fore and aft using the 2 jack bolts mentioned earlier. Inside here, we'll install those now, but not completely. 4 bolts. Pre-screwing these in a little helps. And then we go in. Probably not power tools for this one, but ball-headed hex. Tried to make everything as accessible as possible, but honestly, it's not perfect. So that looks generally complete. Make sure everything is still moving freely. So the ESC carrier, I'm using 10BL 120 G2s. They just slide and snap in. Same with the other. This is just kind of a mock-up of the old G1s actually. And then we slide that down in. We put the bolt in the bottom. You can see the vent hole, so it rams here down the side. There's fans, and it can exhaust out the bottom. So you're probably going to want to clear up your wires and stuff. I run the cables through the holes in the shock tower. You can just plug everything in. Obviously, my cables are too long. The ESC mount goes on the top and it kind of slides back. So I made these little levers. You have to screw them in, but you need a little gap at the top, just like this, where you can then snap it into the detent. And now that all are installed, it can be a little fiddly to get it to line up, and then it slides back. Then you turn the fronts forward and the back sideways, and then it can't really come out. So you just slide in the receiver. I'm using an FSIA 6B or something. Slides back, fits nicely. I need to do something about the antenna routing, honestly. The rear spoiler, this is just a fitment test, but it goes in here. There's a little detent at the bottom, and then you just put a screw through the top. Now we need some much longer bolts for the body. And what I find best is to get these partially installed, get them through, and you try and slide it back, but it's not going to want to go. So at least the first times, push it with a screw, and then you can screw these down just before they snug up. And now it can pop off the front. So we'll just throw on the wing there, the tiny wing, for good measure for looks, but it's done. Now you see I haven't turned down my front bolts, but it's nearly ready to go. So after you've printed 86 of these and some bottoms, you don't need to print all of them. We're going to need some Vitaflex 60 as well as some black resin dye. And Vaseline, at least that, or some other mold release agent. I like to just throw a little bit in every one of these track holders, and you can see these are well used. A lot of these are the same ones from the first gen. And then I use my hot air to kind of melt them and then kind of push it around to make sure it's in everything and coat it. Sometimes they're not perfect, as you can see from the residue. And then I go through all of these and I even out the Vaseline in them. Now, if you have a spray mold release agent, you'll probably be fine, but this is just what I had on hand, and honestly, it's been working really well. As you can see, we've got 20 track holders here, and it takes a little while. Vitaflex can be mixed by weight or volume. I'm doing it by weight, but you want to do a little pre-mix of both of these guys in order to get them kind of evened out. This material has a shelf life once opened, even before being opened, so they won't last forever. So don't expect to use it in a couple of years. I had to throw out half a bottle each before for this project. So even weight, then put in a small amount of the black resin. This stuff gets everywhere. That's surprisingly all you need for these to come out pitch black. It's very little. Keep mixing. I didn't do all the mixing on screen, but just keep mixing. And then I like to use a syringe and just load it from the back. It's too viscous to try and suck up. This is a 35 milliliter syringe. Put in 30 milliliters, gives you some space. Pop the top in and turn it over. I like to try and pull the plunger out a little bit so it doesn't spurt, but wait till it gets all the air to the top. And you're ready to go. Should be about 2.5 to 3 milliliters in every tray, and you can see how I'm filling it. About 1 milliliter in each of the 3 areas, the 2 edges in the center. And it will start flowing out to every corner, but you just want to get the right amount in it. I find the syringe really beneficial for this. So you can see me do everything. I'm just going to do and now for some fast forwarding. The only advice I really have here is you really don't need to be perfect, because we can trim this rubber afterwards. Sometimes voids will happen. It's good to make extra tracks, both print it and mold it. And usually I find if you're mixing, you need about 60 milliliters. So make about 70 milliliters of product, maybe 75, and you're going to have to reload halfway through like I just did. And then you can even them out if you see that they're not perfectly even. Now we just place it in. I place it from one side to the other and then kind of squish it down. You'll see some spurt out. Sometimes bubbles get trapped, which suck, but here's me doing that all again at 10x speed. So you can see a few have overflowed a little bit in those pink trays. There were actually some experimental ones. And you're probably going to need to do this 4+ times. Yeah, unless you want to build 80 trays. So if you did a good job at your Vaseline, they'll just pull right out. In this case, you can see how I've somehow got a void on one side, which sucks. I'm not too concerned about them, but they're very well adhered to the plastic. I've tried this on PLA and nylon. Both work really well. Now we just demold them all bit by bit. You can just start screwing them together. These are designed for those kind of pseudo shoulder bolts, and they might be a bit tight. They'll work themselves in. Going and going. I keep my multi-tool on hand to clear out all the edges that flow over. You want to run things a little inside just to get everything to bed in and start loosening up. This is good for the gearbox, the CV, tripod joint, and the tracks. Sometimes you'll have to make some adjustments to those tracks, you can see, but you're basically ready to go.